Hello, and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics Podcast. I'm Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at SecurityMetrics, and I'm very excited today to bring to you John Elliott. He's a consultant and author who specializes in security directives. He's represented both Visa Europe and MasterCard on the PCI Security Standards Council and contributed to many of the PCI standards, including most recently PCI DSS version 4, which if you're in the PCI world, we're all abuzz about that. He's helped large companies in the financial and airline sectors with complex PCI DSS and GDPR programs. And if you're not familiar with GDPR, that's the European Privacy Directive. In his spare time, John authors online video training courses for Pluralsight. John, welcome. What did I miss?
That was about it, really. I'm just enjoying my independence from working from a big corporate at the moment. Also to do a bit of writing about PCI DSS. But yeah, generally that's it. I'm just doing a bit of consulting work. And history-wise, you summed it up. The last 2 years or 2 and a bit years I spent at MasterCard, mostly in the weeds of PCI DSS version 4.
Well, I'm so excited that you're willing to talk to me. We've had you on before, and you brought us such great knowledge in the past about the PCI DSS and really helping us kind of dip our toe in the water of what is this 4.0, when's it going to hit us, all of these things. Super excited to have you on the show.
And it's a real pleasure. I do have to say something because I've only recently left MasterCard and left working with the PCI standards. Everything I say is my own opinion. It's not like what MasterCard's opinion was. And if I make predictions about things that I think are going to happen, it's things I think are going to happen. It's not inside information.
I appreciate you saying that.
John said that, therefore MasterCard must be doing it. It's like, I don't have any of that information.
Yeah, we're not going to hold you to anything that you said. Just help us understand. And you know, I'm actually kind of glad you mentioned that, because as an assessor, I sometimes will say things because people will ask my opinion, and I think, wow, how much of this opinion is are people going to beat me up over later if I get something wrong, or if things change, or if I've misinterpreted something? And I think it's important to recognize we are all humans trying to sort this out properly together with the best of intent. So welcome to the show again, and let's jump into why. Why is my first question. Why? Why are we... I was just starting to understand 3.2.1. I was just feeling good.
Come on. I mean, 3.2... Version 3 of PCI DSS it's 9 years old. It's 9 years since the last version, the last major release of the standard. So as a QSA, I'm glad you're just starting to enjoy it and get your head around it. And yes, we're all getting our head around it. And I love 3.2.1. I can, you know, I know the numbers of each requirement and things like that. So it's quite a change having version 4. But look, if we think back to 9 years ago, the world was really different 9 years ago.
It very much was.
We didn't have so much cloud infrastructure. Mm-hmm. It was 50-50 whether you would buy tin or buy cloud services.
Right.
Now that's completely changed. We didn't have EMV in the States 9 years ago. You were still doing that swipe and sign thing, right? We didn't have 3DS, the new version of the 3D Secure standard for secure customer authentication for e-commerce. We didn't have the same criminals. We've got loads of new criminals who found exciting new ways of stealing cardholder data. Yeah. And so, and the way we do InfoSec has changed massively in 9 years. So we definitely needed a new version of the standard. It didn't have stuff in it that was crying out for. It didn't have anything to stop e-commerce skimming attacks, for example.
Yeah.
It didn't have quite a lot of modern technologies that people used. And so, yeah, stability is great, right? And if you, I don't know if you remember, Jen, that the standard used to change every 3 years. There was the whole thing when it first came out was a 3-year life cycle. Mm-hmm. And organizations said to the council, look, you can't change a standard every 3 years. We're always trying to catch up with ourselves. And so the council, you know, had a very good mature version with version 3 and 3.2 on top of 3 wasn't a massive change. It was a minor change. Yeah. And so there really did need to be a new version of the standard. Was it too late? Yeah, I actually think it should have come out. I think there should have been a version 4. I think we should be on version 5 now. I think we 9 years is too long to wait. In a very fast technology moving market, 9 years is too long to wait. So And we've seen that because of the length of time it took to birth the standard. I mean, heck, it took it took nearly 4 years from people starting to talk about the standard to the standard happening. And that's a really long time as well.
And it feels like it. Okay, so I actually sent the links out to some of my customers that I know really want to get a jump and want to understand. And their response when I send them the links is, "Are you sure? Are you sure it's actually coming out now?" Because they felt like there were some delays in when it was expected. And can you speak to that at all? Like why maybe it took that long?
Why did it take so long? Two big reasons. The first is that in an effort to be more consultative with the industry, the council decided to do multiple requests for comments. So it started off the process with a request for comment back in 2017, which was like, what do you think we should change? And it got a lot of feedback. And then it issued a request for comment version, like the first version of DSS version 4, request for comment 1, came out and I wrote it down, it came out in October 2019. And I was actually a merchant there, and I was just finishing a very big PCI program.
Okay.
So I wrote loads of feedback, like this is a terrible idea, and how because I was a bit, I was like, because I knew a lot of the people who were writing the standard.
You're both
they were still my
knowledgeable
friends.
and visionary, and you have opinions, John.
Yeah. And I wrote all my opinions down in the feedback spreadsheet, like how on earth could anyone be so stupid to think this is a brilliant idea and things like that.
Yeah.
So I gave my feedback along with, there were 3,200 bits of feedback given to the council on version 1 of the RFC. And every single one of those bits of feedback were addressed. And I know that because that's quite soon, just after RFC 1 closed, that's when MasterCard suggested I came and worked for them. And so I was sitting on technical working group doing the job I'd done previously for Visa Europe. And the first job was to review 3,200 bits of feedback from merchants and service providers and QSAs.
Yeah.
Some of which were my feedback telling people what idiots they were. So that was quite embarrassing.
Cell phone.
Yes. So that's one reason it took a long time, because then we did a second request for comment and we got about 2,000 bits of feedback. Every single one went through. And then because we had a lot of feedback about changing the reports and compliance in the SAQs, we did another RFC. When I say we, I mean the PCI SSC. It's odd not to be part of the we anymore. But the council decided to do an RFC feedback for the validation documents, because we're proposing quite a lot of changes to those.
Yeah.
And so really, the first reason it's late is because the council listened so much to getting feedback. And believe me, if you wrote a piece of feedback, it was talked about. Every single piece of feedback was talked about. Some for maybe 30 seconds, some for probably a couple, usually 2 or 3 minutes per piece of feedback, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes for actually one whole working group call, because it was like, well, that's a really important piece of feedback. What do we do about this?
Right.
Okay. So everything was listened to. Some of it, people who did feedback would be really sad because it was rejected. It was like, no, this doesn't fit the aims of the standard. But believe me, everything was listened to. So that's the first reason. Three RFCs, which the council had never done before.
Right.
The council was never prepared for that level of RFC feedback.
Right.
Like, gosh, that's a lot of work. Secondly, this COVID thing. See, normally technical working group, when we work on a standard, we all get together in a hotel room in some exciting place, like, I don't know, the exciting places were usually where card brands were. So it was either Foster City or St. Louis or Phoenix, which is really nice and warm, which is where Amex is based.
But there's no good food in Phoenix. Let's just
say.
Chicago,
which is really freezing. So we usually meet in a hotel room somewhere near a card brand, and we do that for a week. So we do this what we call face-to-face meetings. There, we have had not a single face-to-face meeting since RFC 1 happened, which means we've done virtual face-to-face meetings, which have been, 30 hours a week of Zoom, or we use WebEx, but that's quite tiring. We don't get through as much. So agree. COVID slowed things down.
Do you know, I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because on a kind of a side note to that is, as we're doing these assessments, a lot of people have said, well, we've learned that we can do assessments virtually. And my response is, no matter how hard you try to do an assessment virtually, to the same degree as the in-person. You miss something, it slows it down. You don't get those interactive. And when you're trying to develop something together, this is a creative, intellectual process, putting these standards together. I can't imagine trying to do this when you're not in the same room where you can have these meaningful conversations, plus the exhaustion of doing it through screens, which is, it does add to that level of tiredness.
And bear in mind, since PCI DSS version 3 came out, when there were 5 brands and Visa Europe on the council, there are now 6 main brands. Well, there are still 5 because Visa Europe got subsumed into Visa, but UnionPay joined.
Oh.
And then also lots of affiliates are joined. So we had people from India, from Canada, from Russia, from Australia. And therefore, some of these people, these calls actually, for me, I'm based in Europe. For me, these calls on the face-to-face meetings for a week finished at midnight.
Yeah.
And so it does add to everyone's transition. And you don't get the same creative stuff. You also don't get the conversations over lunch or dinner or afterwards when all of a sudden you say, you made a really good point there. I think we should go back and look at that tomorrow. Now I've had time to think about it. So if those things happened, if you did have we used to call them backsies, but if you did have let's go back and look at something because I'm not sure we made the right call there. Right. That often took a lot longer than it would have been had we been face to face.
Sure, and frankly, when I first, because the council has been so good about being transparent. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. These are the timelines we intend to meet. And when they said we are going to open this up to a request for comment, these different periods, I thought, do they know the tidal wave of information they're going to get? Do they have enough people to manage that? And then when COVID happened on top of it, I just thought, well, it is just an insurmountable level of effort to meet those timelines. So I wasn't surprised. I'm glad that it took the time it took to get it right. But that sounds like a lot of very intense brain work trying to sort through with people remotely.
Yeah. And all credit to the people who are on technical working group who did that, and especially Lauren, who you probably know, who was an absolute star at managing us and putting the standard together and running through all the feedback. So we couldn't have done it without her. That's
great. I haven't personally met Lauren yet, but I hope to, now that we're getting back to these in-person meetings, which have been such a struggle for a while. Okay, so we understand now we needed a change. I was kind of being facetious when I complained about it, but only because, look, I was finally starting to do chapter and verse on them the way my team lead can do all the time. I don't know if you know Michael Simpson, but I'll be like, hey, Michael, what's the answer to this? And he can tell me exactly almost what page it's on. And I thought, I want to be like that. And everything changed. And now I can't be like that. But
Jen, a lot of it's still the same. It's better worded. It's clearly laid out, more clearly laid out. Right. But a lot of the requirements are the same requirements. They've been tidied up. Some of the confusing language is taken out of there. So a lot of the requirements you love and are familiar with are pretty similar.
That's really good to hear, because people are worried when I ask them, or talk to them a little bit. Hey, keep an eye open for this, but don't panic yet. They're worried. They feel like they finally have their ducks in a row for 3.2.1, and then now they are not. They don't know what to expect, how it's going to change. Are the requirements going to change? Is how they meet? Is it going to change? And so for organizations that are currently successfully meeting PCI DSS 3.2.1. What's that stretch? What is that step towards 4.0 going to look like for them?
It's a big. I'm not. I'm not going to make it minimize it. It's a big change. Okay. The thing that's most important is a lot of the core principles of the standard haven't changed. So although the introductory sections have been substantially reworded, in lots of cases, the council has just pulled the FAQs into the standard of FAQs that came up while in the past 9 years. So it might look a lot more. There is no intent to have changed things like scoping and sampling or anything in there. It's just hopefully it's explained better and more clearly, with the benefit of 9 years of getting feedback from the assessor and merchant and service provider community. Okay. So that there are no conceptual changes, even though it looks like the introductions changed quite a lot.
Okay.
There are 64. I'm checking the summary of changes. There are 64 new requirements. 53 of them apply to everyone. 11 just apply to service providers. So there are a lot of new requirements. But there aren't as many new requirements as there could have been. Some of the stuff that was in RFC 1, like encryption over a private network, like data leakage prevention tools. So some of those have been taken out. Hopefully, if you were to look at the standard now, it's probably what reasonable, I hesitate to use the word state of the art, but reasonable security would be that an information security professional would recognize that those were the controls that most organizations should have in place, with some special ones added for protecting payment card data. For instance, the e-commerce skimming, because the e-commerce skimming is a big problem.
Sure. Yeah. So for me as an assessor, I always start with security. Tell me about your security program. I want to understand their general security stance. And if they understand things like you just said, we should talk about e-commerce skimming in a whole thing at some point. A lot of people are that I talk to now try to lean on, well, we don't have to do that because we have an iframe, and they don't understand the nature of skimming and how it's developed and how people are worried about it, but not to sidetrack this conversation.
Can I just talk about timelines very quickly first? Yeah. So don't panic.
Okay.
It's like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The front page, don't panic.
Yes.
Right, because the standard doesn't become effective until the 1st of April, 2024.
Yeah,
so that's
it
2 years
seems so
away.
far away. And
it does. And then the new requirements don't come into force until the 1st of April, 2025. Okay. So there are 3 years to get your ducks in a row.
Great.
Now, but some of those requirements might take you 3 years, so start, but don't panic. Okay, big changes. There are 53. I'm not going to go through them all. The ones that I think will create problems for organizations that you need to start thinking about. Mm-hmm. If you store sensitive authentication data, so the full track, which hopefully no one in the world stores the full track anymore, but like the 3-digit or 4-digit CVV2 or CID codes,
right.
If you store those pre-authorization in case your authorization link fails and you want to try it again, that needs now to be encrypted. Great. How you encrypt a 3-digit number will be intriguing because it's actually really hard to do.
Yeah.
Because you have to pad it, and once you've padded it, then the padding will be... Anyway, it's quite hard to do. Secondly, hashing. Hashing has gone away. Hashes need to be keyed hashes now. They need to be cryptographic hashes because brute forcing of hashes is so easy that it offers no protection of cardholder data. And that's a really good example of how in 9 years, hashing with a recommended salt 9 years ago was okay. It was just okay, but it was okay. Now it's like people laugh at you if you say that's how you're protecting something.
Yeah, that's not protection. What are you talking about? So, I mean, I'm glad you're mentioning these because, like you said, just because we have 3 years doesn't mean you should wait 3 years to see what the changes are. That is alone potentially a 3-year change if you have architectural implications to that and tooling implications and personnel.
Yep. Yeah, and if you're using hashes a lot, in fact, while we're talking about encryption, let's also mention that Triple Des dies at the end of is it this year or next year? Triple Des dies pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yep. And so
should be dead now, but
it's deprecated after. I'm going to check the date. It's deprecated by NIST, and therefore, if you're using Triple Des, it won't be strong cryptography to encrypt PAN either.
Correct.
So that might be a 3-year thing of having to get code, get resource allocated, get it scheduled into your development timetable. What are the big changes? Oh, in encryption, certificate management. So nowadays, you have to now in requirement 4, you need to validate the authenticity of a certificate you're relying on, whereas before you didn't. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some technical protections against phishing. And that doesn't mean telling your users not to click on phishing links. It means technical measures to stop phishing links coming into the organization.
This is one of my favorite ones because in the past, what did we say? Oh, it's a personnel problem. It's your people are your weakest link. And we need to stop beating up on people because the nature of how human beings react to their work and do their work, you end up getting the most dedicated, helpful people getting trapped by phishing. And then it's just so demotivating. When we have tools that can do it, if we have tools that can help people, why would we not? So I'm really glad to see that one in there.
Yeah, and so tools are really important because everyone clicks on phishing links eventually. I mean, the whole idea of phishing is it's designed to try and trick you. Right. I mean, there are psychologists working out how to try and trick you. So trying to tell people not to be tricked when people are trying to trick them is really in my opinion, just a waste of time. It just makes the users feel terrible. It's just, anyway, different subjects. So the requirement is that there's anti-phishing technology in place, and there is a requirement for training. And the training's got the emphasis on reporting phishing emails.
Nice.
Right? Because if your protective measures have failed, then the only person who might see that phishing email is the user. And therefore, the user is the only detective control we have left to say to the SOC, this phishing email got through. Right, so so the emphasis on the training is reporting phishing emails.
Good,
because that's a positive thing.
I think that's great because that way you put the person as the last line of defense, not the first line of defense.
Yeah, they are. They're totally the last line of defense. Technology should have picked it up. If it hasn't, then you are the last line of defense. Please help us by being a detective control.
Yeah.
E-com skimming. There are 2 requirements to protect against major type of e-com skimming attacks. The first one is to make sure that the only scripts necessary for the taking of a payment are present on the payment page.
That's brilliant.
And that they're authorized by management, and that there is some way of checking the validity of that script.
Excellent.
So that typically means something like content security policy and sub-resource integrity, although they are not specifically called out in the requirement, they're mentioned in the guidance.
Oh, good.
Because you could also use something like some of the content distribution networks will validate the integrity of your scripts before they distribute it to the users, the consumer browser.
Right.
And also, we don't want to be too technologically focused in the standard, so we want the outcome in the standard rather than what technology to use.
Good point. Yeah.
And then in 11.6.1 is a requirement to detect changes in your scripts. Now, I know SecurityMetrics, you have a product that you sell that does that, and so do lots of other organizations. Yeah. So that's now a requirement in the standard. So again, a protective control. Let's try and stop this happening. But we know sometimes it will happen, so a detective control.
Right. It's called shopping cart monitor, or shopping cart inspect is the first step, and then shopping cart monitor is to monitor those changes. And it's like you said, there's a lot of groups that have it, but I wanted to give a shout out to that because the guy that helped develop that, his office is next to mine, and he's pretty cool.
Cool.
So, good job, Aaron. The important thing is that finding those changes. In the past, we used to have all kinds of marketing and upsell type scripts on the page, or just finding out information on that page, and it made it so complex and so difficult to find out if there was anything kind of nefarious going on. So having it being limited to just what's needed to take payment, I think is a great step. I'm super happy to hear that.
I'm super happy that that's what TWG agreed as well, and I'm really super happy that people tell me that content security policy and sub-resource integrity are really hard to do, and they're right on your whole website, but they're not on one payment page. And you could do it on one payment page. And so that will stop a lot of skimming attacks. It won't stop them all because the payment page is still the iframe. It's not the holder of the iframe. And as we know, there are some iframe attacks, right? There are some attacks where Dave is I think it's called. You've done a really great podcast on SecurityMetrics on how iframe attacks work.
Right.
But those iframe attacks rely on badly coded payment service providers. It relies on them not using HTTPS cookies. A well-implemented payment page should be able to be implemented in an iframe and isolated from the parent page, because there's no access between the document object model of the parent page and the iframe. Yeah. And if there was, the whole internet would fail. This separation of same origin policy is really important. And I want to be really clear, because I know people, in fact, even people at SecurityMetrics have argued with me before that the parent page should be part of the payment page. That's not the way that small merchants work. And if we were to change it, we're really worried that everyone would go back to doing JavaScript forms, and it would be a worsening of security, not a bettering of security. So the compromise is what we've got.
Right, and I think that the iframe that is well secured and from a trusted organization that does it well, that is known to secure its payment pages, is the best option for this. I wonder what the bad guys have in store for us next in terms of, it feels like if the information is out there between the user and the wherever that payment needs to go, that somebody is out there trying to figure out how to grab that, and I think we don't know all of the answers. There's probably things out there now that we don't know. This episode is brought to you by our SecurityMetrics penetration testing team. They do a lot of pen tests. They do a lot like network layer, application layer, segmentation checks. They're very, very knowledgeable, and some of them have even won like competitions at DEF CON. So you can rely on these guys to know what they're doing. Head over to securitymetrics.com, learn more about pen testing.
My prediction, and when I said earlier at the top of the show that when I said predictions, it was mine, it wasn't anyone else's view. This is my view, is that will migrate to there are more small payment service providers starting up, and I think they will find themselves the target of more sophisticated attacks than they have been.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest worry, is that service providers, when you can no longer steal the data back out the browser, and really the only place you've got left to attack is the service provider will have much more complicated attacks aimed at them.
I agree. I agree. I'm often much more. I beat my service providers up a lot more than the merchants, because I think merchants that are relying on service providers, their big thing is they should choose good service providers. Yeah. Of course, there are things that a merchant needs to do. But also relying on that service provider, like you said, there's a lot of little boutique niche type payment service providers out there, and we're seeing more and more of them. So hopefully they're all on board the PCI train.
Yep. And let's face it, the attacks against iframes that are successful, the service providers shouldn't have passed their PCI audit given the coding problems the way they coded it.
Yeah.
Big change. System and application accounts weren't really called out in the standard in version 3. In version 4,
That's true.
Call them out particularly.
Okay.
It's like, so there are loads more controls of system and application accounts. Like they exist. They shouldn't have interactive login, but we know they do have interactive login. So if they have interactive login, it has to be really strongly managed. You can't have hard-coded passwords for them in places. Passwords, remember, have to be encrypted. So lots of changes for system and application accounts. Which, if you haven't audited your system and application accounts for a few years, might be a load of work for you to do.
Yeah.
Big one I've got 3 more big ones. Multi-factor authentication everywhere for any user with access to the CDE.
Hooray.
About time. And you should be doing that now. Don't wait for 2025. Do that today,
exactly.
because that's your biggest protection against phishing attacks.
I just make fun of people who refuse to do that at this point. Just like, that's just dumb.
Automated log monitoring, so rather than manual log, no, this is a requirement that's not really a requirement, because no one does manual log monitoring
No, that's
anymore.
insane. What does manual even mean? Are you kidding me? On logs? That's crazy.
Yeah, precisely. So it's just catching up with the world. And then finally, this is the one to start tomorrow if you plan on becoming compliant with DSS version 4, is internal vulnerability scans need to be authenticated rather than anonymous.
Nice.
Your authenticated scan will find 10 or 15 times more vulnerabilities than your non-authenticated scan. So it simulates lateral movement in an organization effectively.
Perfect.
It can
that's
take
where
you...
that's where the issues happen.
Yeah, totally. But if you are I have to be careful. I have known organizations where moving from unauthenticated scanning to authenticated scanning took 3 years to resolve all the positives.
Yes, this can be...
Especially based on the size of the organism.
What does they call in project management? That could be your long pole.
Yeah, that could be a really big thing. And so if you've got a big organization and you've not done this before, I would start now.
And hopefully they have maybe subnetting where they can try it in one and then try it in another, and make sure they know what they're doing before they go breaking everything, but stop, saying why they can't do it and just do it. I actually chose not to read the 4.0 in depth before I talked to you, because I wanted to hear it fresh. And so that's really awesome to hear those things. And I'm excited to go look at it and read it through today later.
Can I advise you and also anyone who listens to the podcast to read the summary of changes document first? It's brilliantly done. I was a brilliant surprise when I saw it, because I hadn't seen it before. It was done after I'd left technical working group, and it's really well written and is really great.
It is sitting on my desktop after our conversation. Definitely.
Everyone start with some of your changes and then move off to the standard.
Okay, love it. All right. So one of the things that feels different is the customized approach. Tell me about the customized approach.
Well, I think I really like the customized approach, right? When it first came out, I was like, and remember, I was a merchant at the time. I was like, I'm not sure about this. But it's taken some work, and I think it's in a really great place. So the customized approach is if as an organization you decide to meet the security requirement in a different way. So PCI DSS has always been massively criticized because it's prescriptive.
Yes.
And it is prescriptive. It is really prescriptive. And actually back when it came out in 2008, heck, it needed to be prescriptive. Even in 2015, it probably needed to be prescriptive. There weren't the same level of knowledge of information security around that then
I agree with you.
as there is now. The profession's changed massively. We didn't have the NIST cybersecurity framework. We probably didn't have the CIS 20 critical, or what it was then, the SANS 20 critical controls.
Yeah, SANS Top 20.
Right? That stuff wasn't around, so it had to be fairly prescriptive to tell people what to do.
Yeah.
Also, so you could audit against it.
Yes.
Right. Now that's changed, and so you could say to an organization, do not let malware execute in your environment as a security objective. We don't care how you do that, right?
Right.
And so the standard will say prescriptively have anti-malware solutions, but you might have an EDR tool, right? You might have an EDR tool across the organization with network monitoring plugged into it as well. You might have some very complicated stuff that wouldn't look like anti-malware.
Yes. Increasingly, I've actually had customers who have said to me, let me tell you about our security program, why it's better than what you've got, and tell me why we can't use this. You're asking me to do something that is nonsensical in this environment. And I would say, let's talk about how PCI works. And so we would try and find a way together. And so that's why I'm excited about this this customized approach, because what it sounds like is it's having respect for organizations that have a mature cybersecurity program, and how does that meet the objectives of protecting cardholder data? Totally.
So a really good example is on requirement 5 is like malware. The security objective is malware cannot execute in the environment. I'm paraphrasing it, but it's something like that.
Okay.
Right. The entity then just has to show how the controls it has decided to put in place meet that security objective. It's quite an evolved process, but it makes it effectively. There are 2 standards in PCI DSS 4, which is really, I think, quite clever trick the PCI SSC pulled off. There's the prescriptive way of doing it, which is called the defined approach, the one that you're used to assessing and we're all used to.
Right.
And then for every single requirement, there is a customized approach objective that says what you're trying to achieve here. And if you can achieve it another way and prove to an assessor that you're achieving it, then you're good to go.
Yeah,
so it's designed for security mature organizations that understand running controls and doing risk. Yeah. It's not designed for smaller organizations who should still follow the defined approach.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's not, the intent is not to let people get away with something. The intent is not to, sidestep some of these requirements. That the intent is good security can be done in different ways. And so understanding that. But like you said, very few small organizations are going to take that approach.
Yeah, the best example I talk about is zero trust. If you properly rolled out a zero trust model and architecture in your organization, lots of bits of requirement 8 don't really apply.
Yeah.
But the objective of what's in requirement 8 does apply. For instance, something like, stolen, criminals can't use stolen passwords or something. Well, zero trust fixes that, yeah?
Yes.
And so if you're using zero trust, then you can still do PCI DSS without having to implement stupid security controls that don't make any use in your environment because you have something else that does the same job.
Right. I think the password requirements is one of the most obvious to most people in terms of the difference between a customized approach and the prescriptive approach, which is and I don't know because I haven't read it yet, but the old rules where it said 7 characters and had to be changed these things and it had this complexity, so there's this way of doing it, and the organizations that I would work with, some of the more mature ones, the larger, more complex, would say our password requirements far exceed what you're asking for, but it does it in a different way. It doesn't have these specifics. How do we match this up? And so I think the customized approach is really, it's very different from because people say to me, well, isn't customized approach just the same thing as, what was it when they couldn't meet it and they had to do something bigger?
Compensating control.
Compensating control. It is not the same concept because the customized approach, you are meeting the requirement in a non-prescriptive way, but it is fully functional. The compensating control is you cannot meet this for some reason, and so you're going to put some other layers on there that are not required.
Yeah, a Band-Aid.
Right?
I'm going to put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, exactly. It is like a Band-Aid. And so I think helping people understand those differences, and I don't know if there's a guidance that's going to come out on that, or just self-evident or whatever.
There is yes, there is a document I understand in preparation, which is going to come out in about June.
Okay.
Which is, I can't remember what it's called. It's like a guide to PCI DSS4. So it'll have some worked examples of how to do the customized approach. It will go into more details. Again, it's a document that I've not been involved in. It's what the working group are working on now. But there was some stuff that didn't make the standard because the standard was getting so long. So we'd written some guides about the customized approach, and it's like, should it go in the standard? Should it go in a separate document? It's not in the standard, so I guess it's going to come in a separate document.
I shouldn't talk about it too loudly, or SecurityMetrics is going to make me do a blog post about it. So okay. Unexpected elements. Was there anything unexpected in 4.0? Anything that kind of surprised you or that would surprise other people?
There are some hidden gotchas there that you might go, I didn't expect to see that. I should say there were 3 RFCs, so the industry shouldn't be that surprised by anything that's in the standard.
If they've been paying attention.
Most of it. Yeah. There are 2 things that are unexpected and that aren't in the summary of changes in the report on compliance, which I know is dear to your heart as an assessor, Jen. Firstly, something can be in place or it can be not in place. Same as before. We've now got a third option, which is in place with remediation.
What does that mean?
You went in as an assessor, you looked at something, and you went, that's not there, is it? Now, I was a QSA as well, so I know that's what happens a lot.
We do that all the time,
And the entity goes, shucks, missed that. Let me put that back in place. And as long as that happens in the course of your audit, you'll accept it as the control is in place.
Sure.
That's now in place with remediation. It wasn't in place when you looked at it to begin with. Now it's in place. You as an assessor are happy that it will be in place again if you looked at it again because they worked out why it wasn't in place and they put it in place.
Okay.
People will game it, I know. People
well,
will
I'm just trying.
Pre-assess.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but the intention is to make it more obvious to management that when you went in as an assessor, 50% of the controls weren't in place. So when the manager signs his AOC off, he's going to say, why is half it in place with remediation? Because sometimes that's not really escalated up to the people who are responsible in the organization.
Yeah.
It's like hidden below. And so there's the 2 intentions. One is that management will see that some of the controls that they had believed themselves were in place all year were actually not in place when they were looked at by an assessor. And secondly, if I'm buying services from you as a service provider and I see you had some things that were in place with remediation, well, everyone will do.
Yeah. And they still pass with that, right?
They're still passed. They're still compliant.
Okay.
It's still a compliant ROC. It's just that we're making clear the thing that happens when QSAs go in and they look and it's an assurance exercise.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've done it for security. I talk a lot at conferences about what's the point of having an annual audit.
Yeah.
And everyone goes, it's like, so we can be compliant and prove to the card brands. It's not. It's the only day you get independent assurance your controls are working, apart from criminals. You have 2 chances of getting your controls assessed.
Yeah.
One is with your QSA. The second is with a criminal. I know who I'd rather find my control wasn't working.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? And that's why assessment's there. It's not to report to the card brands and go, aren't we all clever? It's actually so that you as an entity find out whether the controls you believe are in place are in place.
But I love that. I mean, you really brought it into perspective for me when you said what the intent was. Who is seeing the difference between in place with remediation as opposed to in place, and how that elevates it to the people who are decision makers, who are the ones putting money towards time, resources, who are managing those times and resources, and who are able to affect change, right? So that helps me a lot as an assessor, and hopefully the organizations. If that conversation is going to be elevated on what something wasn't in place and then was put in place, why and what was the effort, and how can it be prevented from happening in the future? In the future, right? So I appreciate you addressing that. It's got my mind going in a completely different direction on that idea now.
PCI has always been criticized as a point-in-time assessment. And a lot of the feedback on the original 2017 feedback was make it not a point-in-time assessment, right? But we didn't really. But that's hard to do. We want people to be able to manage the way they run their controls.
Yeah.
Right. But the assessor should come in, and if the assessor find the controls or a requirement's not in place, then that should be noted if it was then put in place, and the assessor should make sure that the entity's capable of keeping that control running. So it's trying to get more real world.
I love it. That's great. Okay. So is there anything in it that you think people will really like?
People really like standards.
Oh, they love them. There's
okay.
Okay. So let's get back to what you said just a second ago, where you said you have 2 times to get it right, either when the bad guys get in or when your assessor says, "Hey, you're doing great." I had a customer 2 years ago who got hit by ransomware. And when all of the dust settled, they called me and said, "Look, the CDE was not touched." And I said, "I know, because I assessed it." Right? Yes. And so when you have that third perspective, and something changes in the way people do their security controls when they know there's going to be another set of eyeballs on it from outside the organization. So the way they do their work, the completeness with which they do their work, I believe that assessments are one of the great tools that organizations can use to increase their security stance. So yeah, I mean, nobody wants to have their work checked and be told they're wrong. It's very uncomfortable. On the other hand, it's a great way to elevate that. So now that I've ranted about that for a second.
Things that people will really like then. The layout, the standard's been a lot rewritten. The wording is better, it's clearer, the layout of the page is much better. It is longer because of that. The guidelines section we tried really hard to take anything that was a you must do, some of that was in the guidance section, and that's now not in the guidance section. The testing procedures a bit, so it's a easier and better read.
Okay.
In fact, I'd say it almost reads in some places. People will laugh at me and send me rude tweets about this, but some places it's actually is as good as a security book.
Well, just get off Twitter, and then they can't tweet at you.
Okay. So the glossary's in there. People will like, because often people didn't know what. So the glossary's at the back of the standard.
What do words mean?
Yeah, and more of the what do words mean. There's what is a week, what is a month, what is a quarter, what is 6 months. There's a table of time periods, and there's also
excellent.
Here's something everyone will like. Like if it says do it every month and you miss it by a day, you have not failed your annual assessment, right?
Right.
If you miss it by 3 days, right? But if you missed it by a day because something went wrong, like you had an emergency business thing that day, if you missed it for a reason and it's within, what would be considered normal and it's a one-off, that's fine. If you miss it for, because Fred left and it was Fred that did it and no one else did it, that's not fine. But if you miss it for genuine reasons by like a day or 2, don't worry. So that's been added in there. So trying to be more pragmatic, which is hard in a standard.
Mm-hmm.
What will people like? I love the customized approach. I'd like to see a version of the standard with everything else taken out and just the customized approach, because it could then be an information security policy for your company. There's one joke in there that I found, which is in 11.2.1, which is a different number now, but that's why you test for wireless network access points on a, oh gosh, I'm going to look embarrassed now, quarterly basis. Is it quarterly basis, wireless access point testing?
On a costly basis?
Yeah, like every 3 months you test to see if there's wireless
quarterly.
access points.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the way English people pronounce quarterly.
Why aren't you speaking English, John?
I don't know. Anyway, and in the requirement it says, like, I don't care if you have because it says a lot of QSAs have replied, said, well, the entity's got a policy against having wireless networks, so we don't do that.
Oh.
it says like, no, you have to do this every 3 months, because even if there's no wireless or a policy against it, attackers do not read and follow your company policy. And that's actually in the standard, and that
Oh,
made
is
me
it?
smile
That's
when I read
wonderful.
it.
Because that was something that I had to clarify over and over and over again with people. Not have you suddenly added to your wireless, but has a bad guy added to your wireless?
Totally, yeah.
Just because
So
I have a policy against eating cookies after 10 doesn't mean I don't, right?
Correct. And I thought it was just really sweet that actually that was written in the standard. The attackers do not read and follow company policy.
I love that. I'm going to have to go find that now. That's great.
I mean, look, a standard's never perfect, right? It's written by a committee of people who have different opinions, and sometimes they make compromises on what they think is good security as opposed to somebody else think is good security, as opposed to what somebody else thinks is good for the industry, as opposed to what somebody else thinks, well, that's an enormous cost for the whole industry. Do we get cost benefit from it, right? So the standard is never perfect. You won't agree with everything in it. And I've read some interesting comment from people who blog about about PCI already. It's terrible. It's like, no, it's not terrible. It's not perfect. We could all make it better. There are bits of it that I don't think are very good, and I spent 2 years writing bits of it. Okay.
Well, people who write cranky things that's how they get people to click. So take it with a grain of salt. I think it's one of the best standards out there, and I assess against quite a few. So
right.
I think it's like you said, pragmatic. I think that compared to many standards, it's highly pragmatic.
Yeah, and I think this version is, on the whole, if you take it out, you can criticize different little bits of it. Like you might say iframe should be in not in SAQA, for example.
Yeah.
You might say you can find little bits you could criticize, but if you take it as a whole, I think it's a damn good job by the whole industry for the whole industry.
Terrific. Well, any last piece of advice you can offer to organizations who are moving to 4.0?
Don't leave it. Don't think 2025 is a long way away, because if you need to buy stuff, it's not in this year's budget, so you need to get it in the next budgetary cycle.
Yeah.
It might not be in this year's change program. You need to get it into next year's change program or the next year after's change program.
Terrific.
Right. So in big organizations and service providers, level 1 merchants, there's a lot of work to do.
Well, so if people want to read more about what you have to say, which is a lot and great stuff, where's the best place for them to read your stuff?
So the joy of not working for a card brand or anyone where you've got an internal or a marketing department that says, no, John, you can't go on podcasts and you can't write things. The joy of working for myself is that I can now write things. So I'm blogging at pci.rocks. Yeah, it's actually a domain, or pcirocks.substack.com.
Okay.
And I'm trying to write intelligently and not snarkily about the standard, and hopefully give some insights into why things are the way that they are. And also, one of the problems that a brand can never really write about what other brands do. Mm-hmm. So MasterCard couldn't write, and the Visa way of doing it is this. The PCI Council will never say what the brand compliance rules are, because they don't know them, because they're antitrust. And so I'm in quite a useful position that I can write about what the standard says, also put that in terms of what are the brand's responsibilities, what's the acquirer's responsibilities, what's the assessor's responsibilities, i.e. who's going to be liable and who cares about these things. And so mix the standard with the brand compliance rules at the same time. And I think I'm the only person writing in that area at the moment. And I hope that's really useful.
Yep. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today. I really enjoy it.
Thanks for having me again. It's been a pleasure.
Great. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics Podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.